Okay, we left off dealing with how changes in railroading between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century. We looked at the fact that the total mileage greatly increased from 35,000 or so in 1865 to something like 166,000 in 1890, pushing 200,000 by 1900 despite a major economic depression in the 1890s, peaked all time in the year 1919. Okay, that's right before we start paving the roads and driving cars and trucks up and down them. We noted the fact that there were no transcontinental lines at the end of the Civil War. You couldn't take a train all the way to the West Coast. The first line to make that possible was completed in 1869. By 1890, there probably were 4 different transcontinental routes up and down the continent. Let's see, the fact that the companies had adopted a standard gauge for the tracks were 4 feet 8.5 inches apart, and that means your trains will run on my tracks and my trains will run on your tracks. But the companies, despite being hostile competitors, had worked out cross-billing agreements where they would pull each other's cars, so you could load up a boxcar anywhere in the system and ship it to any other part of the system without having to unseal it. That speeds things up. And going back to the increase in mileage, pretty much all the dots on the map are connected by rail, much more as time went by. Okay? I think what we left off with was the advent of steel and new processes, making it possible to produce steel in much greater quantity at a much cheaper cost. So it became feasible to make rails and wheels and axles and boilers out of steel. The boilers would take much, much greater pressure. Steel, by the way, is flexible. Iron is not. So it was a much safer, stronger material to use. It cuts down on train wrecks, makes it possible to make bridges out of steel components instead of just logs tied together. You could have more powerful locomotives, greater speed, all of that. And I was noting as my time ran out last time that the steel industry and the railroad industry grew up together, and you could really not have had one without the other. Without railroads, it simply would not have been possible to bring together in one place the massive quantities of coal and iron ore required to make steel. Once the steel is made, as I left off with last time, the railroads themselves bought up more than half of it. And at that time, having a robust steel industry was the hallmark of an industrial power. And by the 1890s, steel output in the United States superseded or surpassed that of all of Western Europe. So, but it makes railroad train travel safer, not just faster, but safer. There's another thing that made it a lot safer. That was the advent of air brakes by Westinghouse Corporation in 1873 or so. Westinghouse was already there. Now, prior to that, the engineer slowed the train down by slowing the locomotive down. And if you've ever driven a vehicle pulling a trailer, you know that's an acquired skill. So derailments were common when an engineer tried to slow it down too fast, and at the other extreme, try to slow it down too slow. You could pull into the station and you overshoot the platform and got to put in reverse and back up. But with air brakes, and it took time to retrofit and replace train cars, but you could put brakes on every single axle in the whole train. Much safer. All right, let's see. Seems like there was something else. If there's something else, I will come back to it. So, next question, last one on this part. How did these changes in the railroad system affect the lives of rural and small town Americans? Well, this doesn't happen all in a day or a year. It spreads across the country from east to west. And let's just go back in time to where we are. We're in north central Texas, and somewhere in the Weatherford area. Most people have no clue when train travel became available, when railroads penetrated through this part of Texas. I'll clear that up. It was in the 1870s and 80s. The first train rolled into Dallas, Texas in 1873. The first train rolled into Granbury, Texas in 1887. So in through there, that is happening. In 1870, people might not have even thought to wonder yet if the railroads would ever come. By 1890, they would have had difficulty remembering what it was like without them. So we're going to do a kind of before and after. Let's say you live in Weatherford or Granbury or any of these towns out here sometime in the early to mid 1870s, and you don't have rail connections. How do people and goods get to your town? That's how people traveled in those days. They're either going to walk or ride some kind of a horse-drawn vehicle. Okay? So goods getting there. There are stores that market primarily locally produced stuff in bulk. Okay? Things that are packaged and branded. Not too much of that yet. If merchandise is brought in, it has to be brought in via horse-drawn freight wagons, and the shipping costs are a significant component of the price. Things are going to cost more. Now, it's a complex situation. There were a few products that were nationally marketed. There was a clockmaker back in the late 18th century named Seth Thomas, and the day came when there were Seth Thomas clocks ticking away on mantelpieces all over America. But that's a one-time purchase, and it's probably relatively small. Harvesting equipment. Okay, Cyrus McCormick invented a mechanical reaper that would harvest grain much faster in the 1830s. Started a company now known, I believe, as International Harvester, and they would continually improve their product, bring out new models, and to sell the things, they established dealerships. An idea copied later on by the automobile industry. They'd have the latest models for display and for sale. They'd have stocks of spare parts and technicians who could do repairs. But again, that's a one-time purchase, but it's gonna cost more because of shipping costs. And one other thing you might take for granted, let's say you got your brand new courthouse out here and it's got a clock in the tower with faces facing all four directions of the compass. Think about it. Does that clock have to be synchronized down to the minute with the next courthouse clock 30 miles away? Not so much. It's not like you're going to miss Oprah. So we had not yet arrived at synchronization. Now, we had watches and clocks. We had those for quite a while. But as far as they're having to be all set together, we're not there yet. All right. Anyway, here's your town out here, and things are moving slow, and the farmers, there's no point in having manufacturing. The farmers only produce for their own consumption and sell a little surplus to the town. That's it. All right, next day, hot news on the street. Some railroad company is planning to extend its tracks through this region. We don't know yet exactly where it's going to go first and where later and where not at all. So if you're a business person, Chamber of Commerce type, this just gave you a do or die assignment. You have to get the railroad to build through your town, or if nothing else, a spur line, because getting railroad connection does not guarantee that you will live long and prosper. Not getting it is close to a death sentence for your town. It's going to wither and blow away unless it has some really important niche where it can get by. So that's a necessity. Now, another question I throw down for my students, and it seems to be over their head, I don't know why. Did Weatherford, Texas have to sweat this? You're in Weatherford. It's pre-railroad. Do you have to worry about the railroad coming through? Do any important roads come through here? Oh yeah, I-20, right. Okay, let's just take this from the top. You're a railroad company executive, and you're going to suggest where to build the tracks. And you got the map, and you got the dots on the map, and the big dots are the big towns, and the little dots are the little towns, and all of that. Which ones do you connect first? The big dots. And you're not trying to avoid business, so any small or medium-sized dots along the way, you'll go by them too. So the railroad would come through Weatherford sooner rather than later for the same reason that I-20 comes through Weatherford. Okay, wow, from one pane to the next, we've changed clothes and the light's different. That's because what you were watching 10 seconds ago was recorded 6 days ago. Over the weekend, the internet was so chocked up, I couldn't even upload stuff. So you've met with success. The railroad now goes through your town. It's much easier and cheaper for people and goods to get there. The railroad itself is a major local employer. You have to have people working at the train station. You have to have people making sure the right-of-way is in good repair. And passengers are going to get off and want a place to shop or eat or spend the night. And now your farmers have access to a much larger market, so they can tackle, commercial size agriculture. So, and things that become part of your life. Well, before I get past it, you're now synchronized. You have to be, because railroad schedules, train schedules, were the first human activity ever that had to be synchronized down to the minute over a large area. So now it does matter if your courthouse clock is synchronized with the other courthouse clocks. There have been time zones for quite a while. Somebody with time on their hands figured out that at one time or another there were 55 local or regional time zones in use in this country, all unofficial. It's the railroad companies that divided the continental U.S. into 4 time zones. That's long since gone global now, time zones. Okay. The sound of the train whistle. These are steam locomotives that have a whistle on there that it's a sound with personality. It's a sound that's like in full color. And even people of my generation barely even know what one sounded like. But just one little personal anecdote to flesh it out a little. Up in Fort Worth Dockyards, they run a train up to Grapevine and back, and they've got this locomotive over 100 years old, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Well, the original idea was they're going to drive that thing out to Granbury. They did it once. It didn't work out that well, but the day that thing arrived, my mother and my aunt were at my house. This is about 1993 or so, middle of the summer, and they were getting ready to leave. And see, they grew up in the era of there's still steam trains with those whistles. They never talked about it, but here comes the sound of this train whistle it floats out over the town, and they both cried. Just from the time machine aspect of hearing that thing. Okay, as I say, Granbury got train connections in 1887. Some towns were extra lucky. You know where Dublin, Texas is? Dublin was at the intersection of 2 major rail lines. That's hitting the lottery. It may have had more people in 1900 than it had until recently. But the Santa Fe went through one direction, Stephenville down to Comanche and Brownwood, and what they call the Katy Railroad, short for MKT, which stood for Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, came through from the other direction. Next question. You know anything about Glen Rose? Where's the train station in Glen Rose? I don't think there ever was one. Glen Rose was a spa town. The water stank like sulfur because it had sulfur in it. And I can remember we used to drive through Glen Rose and have to roll the car windows up. That's kind of before we had air conditioners in the cars. Yes, I remember that. But people went to Glen Rose to take the baths. So we're going to go next to railroads and industry, the rise of big business.